Right. It is my pleasure to welcome up our first keynote speaker, Eli Holder. He was supposed to talk with Gabrielle Merite. However, she's unable to join us, but I still would like to provide both of their bios and their work because they've both contributed to this talk. Eli is a data designer, researcher, and founder of 3IAP. 3 is a pattern. He specializes in psychologically effective information design, approachable analysis, and human-centered data products. One of my favorite things. Eli's research and writing focus on the intersection of social psychology and visualization design, looking at ways that data can both can both reflect and influence people's attitudes, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. Gabrielle is an information designer who helps ethically driven organizations share their data-based solutions and insights for a brighter future. She's passionate about social justice and our responsibility as humans to be there for one another. Gabrielle communicates analytic findings with honesty, rawness, and compassion. Gabrielle takes a human-centered approach to data visualization, connects deeply where data visualization connects deeply with big picture issues. So I'm going to turn the clicker and the stage over to you, Eli.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Okay, a quick heads up before we get started. We're going to look at some evil Dataviz. It's not evil, but it may have some unintended consequences. And so to save everyone some grief, mainly us, we're going to link to the data sets, not the charts themselves. And also another note, not everything I say in this talk will be true. So take it with a little bit of skepticism. So let's get started. I'm Eli Holder. I am a data visualization designer. This presentation was done in collaboration with Gabby and Merite. She is also a data visualization designer, but unfortunately cannot make it today. In any case, Gabby and I have been very fortunate in our Dataviz design careers. We've done work for big name clients. We have published research. We're speaking at Outlier. And until very recently, we've been fortunate to be able to focus on social impact work. We're very proud, we were very proud to be able to use design to make the world a better place. Or at least that used to be us. Those days are behind us. Now, instead of social impact Dataviz, we mainly focus on evil Dataviz. And not just a little evil, monstrously evil. And we understand that this might be jarring. If you know us, you might wonder, how did Gabby and Eli become so evil and wicked? Well, it starts with a problem that a lot of freelancers might understand. Client work sometimes has dry spells. And so another way to describe us are financially unstable data designers, or at least we used to be. That all changed last year. We had a huge client come through, and they had a, let's say, generous budget. It was actually the state government of Florida. And they wanted us to do a data-driven campaign on climate change of all things. We were skeptical, of course, it's Florida. But as passionate as we are about social impact work, we're also very passionate about not being broke. And so we signed them up pretty quickly. Obviously, it was a lot of money, so we didn't look too closely at the brief. And we admit that there were some red flags that we probably could have caught in hindsight. But hindsight is 2020. Once we got started, though, we realized that things in Florida can get weird pretty quickly. For example, one weird thing about Florida is that it seems weird that a state that's so vulnerable to climate change seems to work so hard to deny that it exists. And this raises some questions, like, is this a political issue? Nope. Is it because Florida's state government is dominated by Republicans? It's not that. Is it that they're in the pockets of fossil fuel corporations? Not that either. It turns out that the state government of Florida is actually run by alligators. And we don't mean this metaphorically, we mean very literally that Governor Ron DeSantis and most state-level elected officials in Florida are, in fact, semi-aquatic reptiles. They wake up every morning and before they put on their suits and their little American flag pins, they put on disguises, they tuck their tails, they hide their scales to make themselves seem human. And this creates some tension in Florida. The thing is, most Floridians care deeply about climate change. There are marches, they advocate against emissions. They have policy proposals aimed at reducing emissions, not just in Florida, but all of the United States. On the other hand, our clients, the alligators running the state government in Florida, have a very different vision for the state. It turns out that alligators are actually pro-climate change. And they're very excited about sea level rise because sea level rise means Florida has more swamps, and alligators love swamps. And all this seems really obvious in hindsight. Of course, Florida is run by a secret cabal of alligators. Before humans ever got to Florida, it was basically one big swamp, and our clients just want to go back to those simpler times. And so who are we to question? And so in short, our design goal is to make Florida swampy again, and so we went with it. And so today we're going to share some insights from the evil Dataviz that we did for the state government of Florida. So how might we use data visualization as a weapon of mass deception, exploiting cognitive biases and social influence to undermine efforts to combat climate change? Like all good consultants, we started with a framework. We actually used some principles left over from when we were still good people, and we just reversed them. So this includes 6 steps: always be neutral, blame people, not systems, stir dissent with stereotypes, undermine social norms, repeat again, and doomsday. And if you ever forget, they make an easy acronym. Evil Dataviz should be absurd. And we knew that we were on the right track because the clients absolutely loved it. So let's get started. A is always be neutral. Evil Dataviz starts with an important foundational concept, which is letting the data speak for itself. There's a great example of this that shows this concept really well from the 40s, and so we're going to watch this a video from an experiment. I have to apologize. The video ends on kind of an ominous note, but if you watch the whole thing, there is a happy ending to it. But what did you guys see? Can you guys raise your hand if you saw a bully? Did anybody see the little triangle as a hero? Less because you didn't get to see the full video. Who saw a damsel in distress? Okay. Right. So that's what you think you saw. But what did you actually see? All you really saw were 3 little shapes moving around the screen. Everything else, all the action, all the drama was added by you. And so the idea here is that our brains construct these elaborate stories from very little information because our brains like to make things coherent even when they shouldn't be. And so not only did you see causality, like one triangle pushes another, you might have even seen intent or personality. Like the big triangle is a bully, the other shapes want to escape. This was done in the 40s, so a lot of people saw gender. And this also applies to Dataviz. When Dataviz is ambiguous and you let it speak for itself, it leaves room for viewers to fill in the blanks with their imaginations. And so instead of seeing what we actually see, a lot of times we just see what we expect to see. This can work to our evil advantage because it kind of turns Dataviz into a mirror. Instead of learning something new about the world, it just lets us reflect people's existing beliefs back at them, which is great for maintaining the status quo. So how do we use this? Again, our evil plan is to accelerate climate change so that we can turn Florida into a swamp, of course, because alligators love swamps. Our plan has a flaw, though, because most of Florida's emissions come from generating electricity. But actually, these emissions come from just 60-ish fossil fuel burning power plants. For example, you can see this top stream is Duke Energy's Crystal River power plant. It's a coal and natural gas plant, and it's one of Florida's largest emitters. But the cost to replace even a huge power plant like this is actually not as high as you might think, at least not for a company like Duke Energy. And so if the alligators that run these utility companies were pressured enough, they could very well decide to just shut these down, replace them with solar. So the challenge here, we're told, is wokeness. People have woken up and connected the dots between fossil fuel emissions and global warming, and so our 60-ish power plants that our planet depends on there we go, sorry. So our 60-ish power plants aren't very popular. And so we want to muddy up this belief. Florida's fossil fuel power plants are responsible for climate change. I want to replace it with something like this. Air conditioners, ice cream, freezers, leaving the lights on. These are responsible for climate change. It doesn't actually matter what people think the cause is, as long as it's not our power plants. And so instead of a chart like this that connects the dots between policymakers and power plants and emissions, how do we make a chart that acts more like a mirror? How can we invite people to kind of imagine their own causes? First, let's combine the 60 power plants into just one big stream of imposing CO2. We don't want to highlight anything that's concrete or tangible. We don't want people to imagine an actual power plant. This also makes it feel more permanent and stuck and movable. Then we're going to tone the title way down. We don't want to mention the alligator policymakers or accountability. We don't want to mention the power plants at all or electricity generation. We can just say electricity or electricity consumption. So change to this. This is a nice, neutral, descriptive title that lets the data speak for itself. Then we'll add total emissions back on top to help compress the curve further. We'll show all the sectors, and we'll give it some happy dashboard colors. And now we're doing pretty well. So this chart is great, not only because it's purely descriptive and lets the data speak for itself, but we're categorizing these emissions into these big, opaque, ambiguous buckets. And these big, ambiguous buckets let your imagination do the work. So ideally, when people see this, when they see electricity, they're not thinking of the alligators keeping the natural gas plants online to maintain their short-term profits. They're thinking of something that's more familiar, more top of mind. Maybe things like using electricity or running the air conditioner at home. And so not only could this be a distraction, it maybe lets us frame all of climate change in terms of things that are more familiar, or things that would require personal sacrifice. Because if we can make solving climate change seem like you have to give up air conditioning in Florida, then we're on a fast path back to the swamp. So the big idea here is let the data speak for itself so that it can say what people want to hear, or at the very least so it can say what people expect to hear. And so instead of learning something new from a chart, this lets it just kind of reflect people's existing beliefs back to them. And that brings us to step 2. We want to blame people, not systems. So instead of just muddying the waters about the cause of climate change, let's actually give Floridians someone to blame. For example, maybe we can get Floridians to blame themselves. The problem is their own personal carbon footprint. Or even better, we can get them to blame someone else. So how do we do this? Let's take a second to think about this chart from one of my experiments with Cindy Merrifield a couple years ago. This shows average hourly wages for 4 different groups of restaurant workers. You can see that, for example, Group A earns about $7 an hour more than Group B. But why is that? Why do you think Group A earns more than Group B? So one way to explain it is through external attributions, like Group A earns more because they work in a nicer restaurant. This is a more generous explanation. But a lot of people, when they see charts like these, will also explain these differences in terms of behavior or personal characteristics of the people within each group. For example, you might say Group A earns more because they're harder working, or because they have better customer service, or they smile more. And these were close to responses that we saw in the experiment. And this is actually an effect from social psychology called the fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias. And this is a bias where we tend to blame people for behaviors or outcomes, even when it's obviously outside of their control. And the good news about this bias is that we can trigger it with Dataviz. For example, these are results from a couple of our experiments where we found that just over half of participants showed this tendency to blame the outcomes in a chart on the people in a chart. And so even though charts like these were neutral, they only showed differences in outcomes, people often misread them as evidence for more intrinsic differences between groups of people. So how do we use this? Let's look at Florida's overall emissions again. This chart is great because it's high level, it lets the data speak for itself, but instead of just burying the causes for emissions, let's see if we can make it more distracting by giving people someone to blame. One easy approach, we switch from total emissions to per capita emissions, or emissions per person in Florida. This spreads the responsibility out across the whole population of the state, as if all 22 million Floridians were totally on board with keeping our 60 fossil fuel plants online. And this is a good start, but it's a little bit risky because there actually are some things that individuals can do to lower their own carbon footprints. And we don't want Floridians to start eating fake beef or insisting on working remotely or, God forbid, getting e-bikes. So we have to be careful here. And so if it's too risky to get Floridians to blame themselves, let's see if we can get them to blame someone else. For example, how do Florida's per capita emissions compare to other states? You can see that Florida is actually right near the bottom. And this makes us look pretty good. A little bit of contrast issues, but at the top of this chart is actually Wyoming. And it turns out that Wyoming is the perfect victim to blame. They have a ton of emissions, but only 47 people live in the entire state. And that's because Wyoming runs these huge coal power plants, not for themselves, but to generate electricity that they sell to other states. And so even if all 47 people were outraged, there's not much they can do because there's not that many of them. They don't have political power. But we can do even better than this. Ideally, we want a chart that doesn't just throw Wyoming under the bus. We want to make Florida look good. And we can do this with rankings that makes Florida look even better. You can see Wyoming is at the top of the list, of course. You can also see that Florida is all the way down at the bottom. And so instead of being the third worst overall emitter, now they're the 10th best for per capita. And this is a little sneaky because emissions are noisy, and so it's maybe dumb luck that Florida's ranking is so low. If you were to read this fairly, you might say that all the ones on the right are kind of tied for second place. But this makes us look good, so we're going to go with it. Another perk is that it introduces an us versus them framework. And so suddenly what should be a collective action problem becomes adversarial. And this opens the way for these nice whataboutism excuses like our carbon footprint is trivial compared to Wyomingites. Why should we be proactive when they can't get their act together? And so drawing attention to outsiders' outcomes gives us a great excuse to delay action. And so our big evil lesson here, we want to blame people, not systems. And Dataviz lets us do this thanks to things like the fundamental attribution error or attribution biases. And for bonus points, it's even better to blame other people or outsiders or people from Wyoming. Not only can social comparisons make us look better, it gives us room for adversarial us versus them narratives, which makes room for all kinds of other mischief. Which brings us to step 3, stir dissent with stereotypes. The thing is, Florida actually really has a lot going for it, at least at the moment. It's warm, it has lots of beaches, it's sunny almost 250 days a year. There's no income taxes, and so the whole state government runs on nothing but sunshine and property tax. But we have a little bit of a problem though, because Florida looks like this now, but obviously by the time we're done, there's gonna be epic sea level rise, and it's gonna look like this. And so not only is this bad for the property taxes that pay us, we're worried that people might actually start leaving the state. And so how do we make people okay with this? The answer, of course, is racism. It's an American tradition. We've been using racism to sabotage social progress for several hundred years now. We've gotten pretty good at it, and it's one of our most tried and true tactics for misinformation. Before we apply this to Dataviz, let's talk about stereotypes. I'm going to define stereotypes a little bit more precisely. Stereotypes are misperceptions of dispersion or variability. And so, for example, let's consider a stereotype that people in the purple group are especially high earners. Stereotypes assume that within a group, people are more similar than they really are, and that between groups, people are more different than they really are. And so this stereotype implies a distribution like this on the right, where not only do people in the purple group earn more, their earnings are very similar, and therefore all purple people seem to earn more than all other people. But in reality, even if average earnings for people in the purple group are higher than average earnings for everyone else, the distribution will still look something like the chart on the left. You can see that earnings are widely distributed within groups, and between groups, there's a lot of overlap. And this will generally be true for many kinds of social outcomes, especially when the groups are based on something as loosely defined as race. And so the next question is, could certain charts create similar misperceptions? Let's walk through another example, this time looking at earnings for 4 different groups. And this distribution on the left is close to reality for income differences between racial groups. And again, you can see there are a lot more differences within groups than there are between groups. And so if we take these distributions and plot them as a bar chart of average income for each group, we'd end up with a chart like this one in the middle. When people see this chart, they may not imagine the distributions on the left. They may imagine something more like this. Without any indication of variability, it's easy to assume that it's not there. And just like with stereotypes, charts like these create a false impression that people within groups are more similar than they really are, and that between groups, people are more different than they really are. And for what it's worth, this is actually another thing that I tested with Cindy a couple years ago, and this seems to be the case. Across 3 different experiments where we compared high variability charts like jitter plots or prediction intervals to low variability charts like bar charts, dot plots, confidence intervals, we found that the charts that emphasize variability reduced stereotyping relative to charts that hide variability. And so our Dataviz design choices actually can influence things like stereotypes. So how do we use this? Let's come back to sea level rise. This scatter plot shows how many homes in each neighborhood in Florida will be completely underwater with 5 feet of flooding, or 5 feet of sea level rise. So each dot on the scatter plot represents roughly a neighborhood. You can think of it as a collection of a few hundred houses. The y-axis is how many homes in each neighborhood will be lost completely to sea level rise. And so the neighborhoods up at the top will be completely underwater and lose 100% of their homes. The neighborhoods at the bottom will be completely safe. And then the x-axis represents how much a typical house is worth in each neighborhood. And so if I give you enough time to actually look at this chart, you might see that the damage is concentrated in this middle range of houses where most people live. And since this is middle class, this would hit us pretty hard in the tax base. And so we want to bury this story as much as possible. So instead of a scatter plot, let's just drop the x-axis and we'll show housing. We'll drop the x-axis that relates us back to wealth or the middle class. And instead we'll just do a jitter plot showing how many houses in each neighborhood will be lost overall. And this is maybe actually worse because if my math here is correct, it makes it more obvious that at 5 feet of sea level rise, 42% of homes in Florida will be underwater. And so instead of showing the overall damage, let's break this out into racial groups and try a divide and conquer technique. As you can see, Latina people will be most affected. They lose 59% of their homes. White people will be the least affected, losing 34% of their homes. But it's still fairly clear that a lot of white people will lose their homes, if not their entire neighborhoods. And so we want to bury that story too. So next, let's drop the jitter dots. We'll hide the within group variability. So now we're just looking at overall rates for each group. And we might start to see some stereotyping here. We've also dropped a lot of, we've messed with some risk perceptions here. And then next we'll switch to bar charts just to make it look more conventional. We want the chart to feel as familiar as possible so it sneaks in under the radar. And then let's actually change the baselines. Now instead of absolute risk, we're looking at risk relative to a population average. Not only does this emphasize the differences, it makes it feel a little oppositional, as if good outcomes for white people somehow require bad outcomes for everyone else. And then we'll zoom in a little bit further to make the gap seem even bigger, and this is a pretty good evil chart. So let's walk through some of the effects. The first evil effect is giving white people a false sense of security. They might read this we might read this as sea level rise won't impact people like me. And one of the things that we know from health communication research is that it's very easy for people to mistake lower relative risk for lower absolute risk. But just because white people have less risk than everyone else doesn't erase the fact that they'll still lose millions of homes. Another misread of this chart might be something like, wow, good thing people like me are good at choosing real estate. And this is sneaky because it's not just giving yourself credit that you don't deserve, it's framing these outcomes in terms of personal choices. But white people don't live in less vulnerable neighborhoods because they have a better eye for real estate. It's closer to things like having a couple hundred years head start on building up wealth and home equity and just having more options. However, thanks to attribution biases and maybe Florida's efforts to erase Black history, we might expect people who see a chart like this to just blame the victim. They might read this as Latina people make poor choices on where to buy real estate. And what makes this sneaky is that at a group level, this blaming tendency translates basically into a stereotype about Latina people. It reinforces a misbelief about a whole group of people having bad judgment. And here's where things get really sinister. Stereotypes like these have broader implications for things like public policy support. We tend to support policies that benefit people like ourselves or other people who we think deserve the help. And so we're less likely to support a policy if we think that it helps people solve a problem that they brought onto themselves. And so a chart like this can potentially have a double effect. It reinforces stereotypes that make Latina people seem less deserving, while at the same time suggesting that Latina people would benefit the most if we actually solve this problem. And if you think that mitigation policies mainly benefit people who don't deserve them, you're less likely to support those policies. And so altogether, this means that we might reasonably expect that white people who see a chart like this would become a tiny little bit more resistant to solving sea level rise, not just for Latina people, but for all Floridians. And this is all pretty horrible, so as you might have guessed, the alligators absolutely loved it. Not only does this give Florida's white middle class a false sense of security, it maybe erodes support for policies that might actually keep people out of the swamps. So our big evil idea here is that we want to use Dataviz to promote harmful stereotypes. And stereotypes aren't just harmful for the people in the charts, they can actually hurt all of us by undermining public support for policies or collective actions that benefit everyone. That brings us to step 4, undermine social norms. One of our main challenges with the swamp plan is that Floridians, more than people from any other state, believe in climate change. And this is obviously bad because it means that they might expect us to do something about it, which would ruin our plan. So how do we shift this number back down? How can we undermine beliefs in climate change? Opinion polling is helpful when you need to convince people of something, but the facts aren't on your side. With opinion polls, you don't need to prove that an idea is good or that it makes sense. You just need to show that it's popular. How does this work? We'll walk through an example. This is Jake. He's a dog. This is Jane. Jane is also a dog. And fun fact, Jake and Jane are friends. Jake trusts Jane. And then let's start with a ridiculous idea. Let's consider something completely unjustified, like Eli and Gabby's presentation is really great. So if you were to ask Jane what she thought of the presentation, she'd probably say it was the dumbest thing she'd ever heard. It turns out that Jake also thinks it's dumb, but he's a little more open-minded, and so he's somewhere in the middle of the scale. But let's say that Jake somehow learns of Jane's attitude towards our presentation. Since Jake trusts Jane, we'd expect Jane's attitude to actually influence Jake's. And so he'd become a little bit more negative to get closer to match Jane. Jake's attitude shift in this example is a social conformity effect. And this is another idea from social psychology describing how people change their beliefs, actions, attitudes, and behaviors to match the people around them, particularly if they're socially close or similar. And it turns out that social conformity effects can also work through charts. For example, imagine if Jake saw this polling result showing that our presentation was extremely unpopular with all US adults. Just 17% of US adults approved it. We would expect this to influence Jake in a similar way that Jane did. And this effect also applies when the charts show two different groups. For example, imagine a polling result showing that dogs hated our presentation. The cats, because they're evil, actually were really positive about it. And so in this case, if you took a moderate dog like Jake and a moderate cat like Tom and show them these polling results, then you might actually expect Jake and Tom's attitudes to diverge away from each other and become more polarized. And this is another finding from one of my research projects last year, where we found that not only do people change their attitudes to match what they're seeing in the polls, this can have aggregate effects that look a lot like political polarization. For example, the charts showing polarization, increased polarization by about 20 points on these 100-point scales, basically doubling the amount of polarization that we saw in the control condition. Clyde's love that. So what do we do with this? Back to the problem, most Floridians believe in climate change. And in fact, in a recent survey, it shows that around 90% of Floridians believe in it. And so how do we undermine this? If we take a closer look at these survey results, we can find something to work with. They asked a more specific question about beliefs in climate change. In particular, they asked people whether they thought it was caused by human activity or whether it was caused by natural changes in the environment. And it turns out that just 57% of Floridians believe that it's caused by human activity. And so even though 90% of Floridians believe in climate change, only 57% believe that it's caused by humans. And so we can work with this. What's great about 57% is that it's pretty close to half. And so we can accurately run a headline saying only half of Floridians believe in human-caused climate change. And of course, human-caused does a lot of work here, but fortunately for us, most people won't read it that closely. And it's at least technically true, and so it makes a good headline. So together, the headline and the 57% make this belief seem somewhat unpopular, or at least less popular than our original 90%. And so as people see that it's unpopular and they conform to the misleading social norm, we might expect people to express more doubt in human-caused climate change. But actually, we can do even better, since this belief is actually already a bit polarized between conservatives and liberals. It's worth noting that it's not polarized between Republicans and Democrats. That gap is much smaller. One of the fun things about surveys is you can change the groups, you can change the phrasing, and get to stuff like this. And so not only does this give us a polarized chart, we can truthfully run a headline like this one: human-caused climate change is polarized in Florida. And again, if we remember our 90%, this is not true, but actually if you look at the underlying groups, it kind of seems that way. And so this headline is even better. It's still true, but it's much more spicy. So now we've got, since we're showing the results split by identity groups, we'd expect people's beliefs to change according to their identity groups. So liberals would drop by a little bit, since 80% is just a little bit lower than 90%. Meanwhile, since 37% for conservatives is much lower, for people who identify as conservative, we'd expect a bigger drop. The overall effect of this divide and conquer technique is maybe that the group-specific social norms could bring down the overall average even faster. And so our evil tactic here is that if you can't win on the facts, you can always win on the polls. So thanks to social normative influences, we can use the social nature of our beliefs, particularly our political beliefs, to change people's minds on something without all the hard work of having to justify it. Which brings us to step 5. Repeat it again. Repeat again. So one problem with our polling campaign is that some people, like Jane, don't read the polls. Jane has no interest in them. She's quite wise. But that makes it hard to reach people like Jane with her evil Dataviz. So if we wanted to muddy up Jane's beliefs in climate change, maybe by undermining the credibility of climate science, how do we reach her? One thing to consider, do we even need the polls or any of our fancy Dataviz? People are exposed to more news headlines than they could ever possibly read, and so maybe we could work with that. So one thing we can work with is maybe the truth by repetition effect. So when we hear information repeated again and again, we start to believe that it's true, whether or not it actually is. And so this suggests that to persuade people that something is true, we don't actually need Dataviz or really any facts or evidence at all. We can just make it seem true by repeating it. In this study on the truth by repetition effect, they tested true statements like climate change is real, and repeated exposure to that increased believability. And apparently repeated exposure for false statements like this presentation is so great also increased believability. And so if you repeat it enough, it starts to become true. So how do we use this? Even if we can't get Jane to look at our polls or our fancy charts, maybe we can reach her through the headlines, but we'll need a headline that's spicy. One angle to take, since climate science is obviously very complex, there's a lot that we're still learning. There's expected uncertainty. We still don't know things. And so maybe we could conflate scientific uncertainty with just doubt about climate science in general. This is obviously a ridiculous premise. But what's great about a ridiculous premise is that it grabs your attention. And so when stories capture a lot of attention, other publishers will pick them up and start to cover it, and you'll see similar headlines pop up all over the internet. And so even if an idea is ridiculous ideas make for great headlines, and so they're repeated several times. And if truth by repetition applies in this case, the more that they're repeated, the more believable they become. And so if at first they don't believe, repeat, repeat, repeat. And that brings us to step 6, our final step, Doomsday. A final thing that we need to deal with is that there has been progress on fighting climate change. For example, global emissions might have actually peaked recently. We're making things better. And this is bad because feelings of momentum and progress can be motivating to make even more progress. So we need to shut this down. We want to go back to more charts like this. The world's likely to see its hottest year on record in the next 5 years. The melting of mountain glaciers has accelerated. Reef sharks are increasingly disappearing. And so even though all this is accurate, it still evokes fear. And from an evil perspective, fear is something we can work with, but it's a risky tactic because it can actually be motivating. But it's not always motivating. It depends on whether or not people think that there's a path forward, some way to resolve the fear. Do they feel a sense of efficacy? Because without a path forward, a fear-based messaging can actually backfire. And so if we just create fear and tension without giving people an outlet, this might help shut people down. And if we keep it up over time, it can potentially lead people to just tuning out the information entirely. And so for our evil purposes, we want to create tension, constant tension, and avoid ever giving an outlet. So we want more charts like this. July 2023 was the hottest month ever recorded. 2024 is looking hot too. Heat is projected to kill nearly 5 times more people by 2050. That's because climate change is accelerating. It's accelerating very quickly. The oceans are boiling. We've passed all the tipping points, and the polar bears are so mad at us. And this brings us to our last point. If you can't persuade, just scare people, exhaust people. There's a fine line between urgency and emotional exhaustion, and if we keep the fear dial up to 10, and we never talk about progress, we never give people a way to channel their nervous energy, we can turn that urgency into fatalism, which is great for evil. And with that, we've completed our absurd framework for evil Dataviz. Always be neutral, blame people, not systems, stir dissent and stereotypes, undermine social norms, repeat again, doomsday. We've already proven the absurd potential of our absurd framework in Florida. Our clients are thriving. In fact, the clients liked our framework so much that they've already re-signed us to take on Florida's public health communication. We're very excited about the potential for absurd evil Dataviz in the upcoming bird flu pandemic. But as much chaos as we've caused with climate change, there's even more potential for absurd Dataviz in public health. So we're very excited. And we hope you'll join us, and we hope you'll remember that with information, we can absolutely change the world for the worse or the better. Thank you.
All right, let's see. Oh, yes, it works. All right, sure, take a seat. Okay, so let's open it up to some questions. We're going to take questions in person. We have 2 mics at the edges of the center. We're also going to take questions from our virtual attendees, and we have someone here in the audience who is monitoring those questions and will ask those on your behalf. So let's open it up. Oh, and the mics are on. That's even better. Well, while we wait for people to ask the questions, I just have, I have some questions. It was more about the presentation versus the individual items in the presentation. So, evil. I mean, I think that's it's an interesting way to approach a data visualization talk. What made you feel comfortable in framing it that way?
It's not.
No, but here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go. It's not so much comfort as I think necessity. Okay. A lot of it is scary and can be kind of dull. And so reframing it in a way that reverses it is meant to be hyperbolic. It's meant to be silly. And so it's a way of, nobody would come to an ethics talk, I don't think. I don't think that it's hard to keep your, it's hard for me to focus on things like that. And so it's a way to package it up and make it feel more approachable.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, Kevin.
Is there a group that's looking at data visualization almost like a pop culture myth-busting group? Like, here's a viz that's out there that's being used, maybe, like an insert journal. Here's a recreation of it to actually like reverse those concepts and like show the variability or be more respectful to the truth that you're telling.
I don't know of one, but I like that idea if you want to work on that together.
All right. You're next.
Hi, my name is Alex. I was wondering, of course, I totally agree with you. I love the ironic framing of like making something evil. I guess I'm wondering, how can I take away like the opposite of absurd? I almost want like another like intelligent or like good or another acronym.
So it was
do the opposite.
It was kind of a joke, but I do have a set of things that like I have a set of principles that I'll turn to, and we did the first half of the framework was basically like flipping them.
Sure.
And so you can do that backwards, and that gets you to a little bit of it. And we also worked backwards with the examples. So I've given similar talks like this non-evil style. And a lot of this was just taking those examples and literally just doing them backwards. And so the ones that we started with, I think, are a slightly better way to do it. Not saying that it's perfect. There's stuff to figure out in kind of all of these cases. Yeah, this particular talk was more raising questions. But we have stuff online to you can look up any of my writing or things like that. And there's there should be some examples of how to not be absurd.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi, I have a request from our virtual audience to please repeat the question on the stage in your handheld mics. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Hi, my name is Becker. I come from a world of BI, the more business side of visualization, and I love the points that you made, especially around constructing stories, and kind of what I took away from that was importance of context and adding all of these things into our work to point people in a specific direction. And I've seen a lot of examples of this kind of advice regarding more static visualizations. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the more interactive type of visualizations that my team builds, especially since you can add a lot of context, but that requires high levels of data literacy usually to be able to access it in the form of documentation and aids like that. So wondering what your thoughts are.
Okay, I'm going to try to rephrase or repeat that question. From a business intelligence perspective, how do you reframe this, the absurd, to make it work for interactive visualizations? Especially, there was also some annotation and some additional like data literacy components to what's in the workplace. So how would you, what's your thoughts on that?
Right. So how do we add context when in a situation where the chart itself changes? I think so. My understanding of and my hunch about the way that a lot of this works is that we have and Matt's about to come up and correct me, but we have a lot of this stems from the stories that we tell ourselves about what's happening underneath, and a lot of this comes from seeing things as causes that aren't causes, or seeing things that as causes that are like smaller than they really are. And there's some stuff in looking at like illusions of causality that suggests that if you don't necessarily need to like correct the wrong story. If you can give people a correct story, it helps kind of open up your brain to be able to see like there are other things than the thing that I immediately jump to. And so, for example, one of the first examples in this was looking at the blaming effect. There's another study that suggests that the blaming effect is actually like what all of us do. That's our immediate thing. We jump to, we see something bad and we're like, oh, it's your fault. But the process where we jump to external attributions is actually like a second step. It's harder. It's a thing that takes more cognitive effort. But if you prompt people with that, if you can prime that a little bit, it can help people consider that there are alternative explanations to this than what I'm immediately seeing. And so, but in the context of a dashboard that's going to change, I don't think that you need to. The context doesn't need to adapt with like every possible like setting or anything like that. Like that would be cool. But I think having stuff on the page or nearby that speaks to like, here's the broader context, here's some things that you might not consider when you're looking at this, is a way to just start to prime other explanations for what people are seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Matt.
Matt came with a question. So I really enjoyed this talk. One of the things I was thinking about as you were giving the talk was when you talk about deceptive visualization, I think a lot of the conversation is not useful in the way that your talk was useful, right? You know, talking about sort of a more like Tuftian perspective on like lie factors or access truncation or things like that, which were not really any of the things that you were using to be evil.
That's amateur evil.
Right. I think you have a much more elevated form of evil, right?
Thank you. Thank you. That's flattering.
And a lot of it is in like data transformation or missing context or all of these other things you've been talking about. And so I guess I'm wondering like, how do we have that more sophisticated conversation about evil and not just like talking about y-axis truncation?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, let's repeat the question. How do you have, let's see. How do you have a more robust conversation around how to be evil when it's not just using truncation? Because
Or how to not evil, I guess, is the
Not-
interesting part.
yeah, I mean, you could flip it. I guess with great power comes great responsibility. Right, and so a lot of the conversation has, or a lot of examples previously have been around truncation and some of those things that we commonly see, but you really elevated that. And so can you address from that perspective and not just the truncation or the things that we've typically seen out there in the world?
So I think what a lot of advice and a fair amount of research focuses on the clarity of charts. Are you reading it in the way that you expect? And so things like all the Fox News tricks are just ways of making sure that you like misread the chart at an immediate level. But the stuff that I find, the true evil charts are ones where you can read it and fully understand the data and still walk away with the wrong impression. And so I think and we'll cover this in my workshop on Friday. One of the things to consider is the downstream consequences of how. So a chart first informs you, and it creates a set of information in your mind that then turns into beliefs. Beliefs can then affect your attitudes. Attitudes can then affect your behaviors and your decisions. And so I think there should be a push more into consequentialism of what do charts do beyond just being misread. And maybe it's not just charts, maybe it's like information in general, but there are just other steps we can take beyond just like this chart was unclearly communicated, because you can still have these consequences even with well-intentioned, accurate, clear charts.
All right, I just want to do a quick check. Pierre, do we have any questions from our virtual audience? No? Okay, I just wanted to make sure we weren't leaving them out. All right, over to my left.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, how do you combat misinformation and doubt without always being on the defensive and kind of increasing that polarization between groups, especially since, as you mentioned, some of those absurd headlines are the ones that get passed around. So how do we make clear, good information also get passed around?
Okay, so the question is, how do you combat misinformation without doubt and defensiveness, especially when misinformation can be easily passed around? And how do you get good information to be passed around?
So I think there's two parts to that. One is the creating more doubt with new information or creating kind of pushback from people. My understanding is that it is there are effects like reactance where you correct somebody and it leads to it maybe leads to kind of an emotional response like, how dare you correct me? I'm going to believe my thing even stronger. My understanding is that like even with that considered, it's still better to correct. It's still better to make sure that misinformation doesn't stand. And I think this is unsettled. But the way that it seems to me is that on the margins, it is better to correct. And so I wouldn't be too shy around that. Your other question around like, how do we get good information to be passed around is hard. I mean, that's kind of the $1 zillion question, right? I think that's kind of a question for all of us to think about is what can we do to try to be as truthful as possible and as kind of accurate as possible and still get it to work. And it's very hard. Like even with this, like there were parts where it was like, maybe like embellished, like, or like, I don't know, like if you have to construct a whole like alligator conspiracy theory to talk about things, like it's revealing of the problem of being truthful kind of being boring is a fundamental thing that we all deal with. I don't know. I think it's just we keep up the fight and keep practicing.
I have a really quick follow-on to that. So what do you think about being a little eye-catching or clickbaity with your headline to draw people in? Because generally speaking, people, I mean, that's the hook, right? And so the hooks, if they're outrageous, they're going to grab attention, and that seems to get passed on, especially if it confirms your belief. So what do you think about just having a really spicy hook for good information? Is that one way we could
So I think
make that pervasive?
it frames the problem. A lot of the way that we think about like what makes good Dataviz is or what makes any good media is how many people do we reach? We've all been trained to think that way. It's deeply baked into the attention economy. I think the premise of you need to make a headline more spicy, even at the cost of it being like less truthful because it gets clicks, is maybe kind of dangerous in and of itself, because you're basically saying like, I want to optimize this headline that's going to mislead people to reach more people. And so I think it's considering we want to come back to, is the reach worth the potential to mislead? I'd rather have a boring headline that's truthful that reaches nobody than a spicy headline that reaches everybody that potentially misleads.
Okay, thank you. To my right.
Hi, I'm Leticia. So I think I agree with almost everything you said, like everyone else, but I would like to not necessarily pose a question, but a point of view on what you said. So coming from a place that had just been underwater for 20 days because of a climate disaster, I come from the south of Brazil, and we had more than 2 million people impacted by the floods that happened last month. I understand your point on not putting fear first, and I agree with it. I also don't think we have another great answer, and I think that people were not necessarily aware of the consequences. And this was something that came out in 2015, but the government shut it down. We didn't do anything about it. So now we're seeing the impact of everything that has been happening. And I don't think that I don't think that fear is the only answer, but at the same time, I don't think we have been seeing other great answers as well. And or approaches in general, and I don't think people read or listen to those things about it. So last year in Utrecht and Play Plus Talk, Mushan gave a great talk about how we don't really have great ways of showing people in climate emergency and what is happening. Like he talked about how using 1.5 or 2 as the Celsius increase is not really a great way for us to move forward for it. But I don't really see any other option as well. So I wanted to give your perspective on it. Like, what have you seen that you think is a good way for us to move forward? Because honestly, I've seen the consequences of not paying attention enough. And I wonder if we were the ones to put a little bit more fear on people, if we would have been in this situation in the first place, you know? Or at least more prepared for it. Sorry, it's a long story.
It's great.
Let me try to recap that. Oh, gosh.
What other alternatives
Yeah.
have you seen on climate emergency apart from fear, but still in a way to draw people's attention?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so the point was around alternative ways of getting people's buy-in and awareness instead of just fear, and really the consequence of action or inaction. So it's not so much a question, but a point and a great story that I would have people connect with you to learn more. But yeah, so that was the point.
So I want to be clear that none of what I said is meant to be is meant to say that we shouldn't talk about it, that we shouldn't try to make people try to help people understand what's happening. I think, and so even for some of the ones where I was showing like differences by racial groups or things like that can be dangerous, but there are other ways of kind of talking about it. And I think in the so for your question around how do we do this without relying on fear, I would say there's two parts to that. So one is fear can be effective as long as you this is slightly contested too, but fear can be effective if you give people an outlet, if you give them something some way to channel that fear. And so pairing it with things that they can do is maybe one way to talk about it, giving people an outlet, using that sense of urgency. Another thing to think about is another thing to pair it with is progress. So showing like the way that feedback works is there's kind of a push and pull to it, where if you want people to be motivated to change something, you need to show a gap. You need to show that, like, hey, we're not where we are, where we need to be, but that can be discouraging. On the other hand, if you show people here's how far you've come, that can also be motivating in a different way, and it can help kind of push people forward and help maybe offset some of the tension and the fear and the just exhaustion. And so I think it's about balancing scary stuff with things that remind us that we're making progress, I guess.
All right, we are actually at time. We have 2 questions, and so if you need to self-manage your break, we are up against a break. Otherwise, if you want, we can do 2 quick questions. So to the person to my left.
Hi, thank you. I'll be really quick. I'm Josephine from Vancouver, Canada, and I'm really excited to be here. My question for you, Eli, is how do you manage your own unconscious or conscious biases as an information designer? Do you have maybe one tip that you could share with us?
All right, so real quick, to repeat the question, can you share one tip of how you manage your unconscious bias?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. I mean, I catch myself doing things all the time where I realize that I'm basing some chart or some communication on an assumption that is not fair. I think the first thing is just recognizing that even if you know about it, even if you're on guard for it, it can still happen. And so it's more around recognizing the problem, recognizing it even in yourself, and just kind of staying vigilant. I wish I had a more like crisp response to that, but that might make a good blog post or something.
That would.
It's a great question.
All right, and to my right, and our last question.
Really quickly, rather than thinking of things in terms of good and evil, how do you go about communicating things that establish a sense of trust to a community that is coming from a place of mistrust?
Ooh, that's a good question. All right, y'all, to repeat that, instead of thinking about it in good versus evil, how do you instill trust for people who are coming from a place of mistrust? Ooh, I think you could like really do a lot of big things with this answer.
There's a lot to that, and there's starting to be like a fair amount of research on just like trust in Dataviz that I think can speak to some of that in a more direct sense of like what would you put on a chart that makes it more trustworthy. But it reminds me of John Schwabish and Alice Fang have their Do No Harm report. And they've done a couple versions of those. And one of the things that I love about that is their focus on the stuff that happens before you ever get to a chart. So going out and talking to people in the communities that are being represented in the charts is a great way to understand the full context of things. And I think it's a good thing to do in general. Like as much of I guess a data geek as I am, like I think you can learn so much more through just calling people, talking to people. The qualitative side of things, I think, is very is a little bit underrated, and I think that's a good place to start. And the things that you learn from just having conversations, getting extra context, hearing just people's little stories about things, the anecdotes I think are what make it like relatable and feel like feel like it cares. I guess that's kind of a corny way to put it, but a lot of that comes with just getting out and talking to people.
All right. Thank you so much, Eli, for your talk and all of the great Q&A.